The first truck announced itself long before anyone on the mountain slope could see it. The whine of its engine climbed out of the valley in ragged waves, a tired diesel protesting every meter of the road. Down below, the headlights swept across the rock like thin knives of dirty yellow, cutting shapes out of the dusk. On the ridge above the curve, men lay pressed into the cold earth, faces streaked with dust and sweat, fingers curled around old rifles that had cycled through 3 wars. The smell of crushed thyme and damp stone mixed with the bitter tang of gun oil. Someone shifted. A small avalanche of pebbles ticking down the slope, and a hand snapped out in the dark, firm on his sleeve. Nikos froze, feeling his own heartbeat hammer against the ground, as if the mountain might betray them by echoing it down into the gorge. From his vantage point, he could see the leading truck clearly now, the Italian flag painted on its side, the white and red dulled by mud. In the open cab, an officer with a peaked cap leaned back, one gloved hand resting on the door, the other holding a cigarette as if this narrow road was a boulevard in Rome. He was laughing, head thrown slightly back, the cigarette glowing when he brought it close to his lips. Behind him, a line of trucks labored along the cliff, each one so close to the next that a single mistake would send them tumbling down together. Above them, the rock wall rose steep and black, and above that, hidden in crevices and behind scrubby bushes, the silhouettes of partisans watched in silence, invisible to the men below who thought themselves masters of this land. A palm slid across Nikos's shoulder and squeezed twice, the signal to hold fire. He felt the tension ripple along the line as if transmitted by nerve rather than flesh. It went against every instinct to let such a convoy pass untouched. These trucks stacked with ammunition, tins of food, perhaps sacks of grain and flour stolen from the plains to feed the occupiers. But tonight was not for heroics. Tonight was for learning. Beside him, Eleni adjusted the angle of the battered field glasses pressed to her eyes, her breath fogging faintly in the cooling air. She murmured counts under her breath, almost inaudible. 1, 2, 3. Tracking vehicles, noting the gaps between them, the positions of the machine guns mounted on the last truck, the way the men sat, hunched or relaxed, alert or bored. The officer in the first truck, Major Carlo De Luca, though they did not yet know his name, flicked his cigarette butt out into space, where it traced a brief orange arc before vanishing into darkness. He said something to the driver and gestured up toward the mountains with a lazy wave, as if addressing the stones themselves. The men in the back of the truck laughed, their voices carried up in tatters by the shifting wind. Nikos could not make out the words, but he knew the tone now, that mixture of contempt and bravado that had become part of the landscape. It sounded like the soldiers who had laughed when they marched through Larissa, like the officer who had patted a starving child's head as if congratulating a dog performing a trick, like the radio broadcasts that called them bandits and cowards. Up here, the air was thin and cold, but the resentment was thick enough to taste. They let the convoy crawl past, one truck, then another, engine after engine grinding and coughing as the vehicles negotiated the hairpin. Nikos counted 9, then 10, then 11. Each one was a piece of a larger puzzle, a pattern of supply and movement that they would soon have to break. When the last vehicle disappeared behind a bend downstream and the noise began to fade into a dull, distant rumble, someone finally exhaled. The men around him stirred, stiff muscles cracking in the chill. "Only peasants, eh?" someone muttered quietly in Greek, just loud enough for the nearest comrades to hear. "Just peasants watching from the rocks." Eleni lowered the glasses and smiled without humor. "Let them laugh while the road still belongs to them," she said. "We'll see how much they laugh when the mountain answers back." The mountain had been watching for a long time already, since 1941, when German planes had screamed over the passes and Italian infantry had tramped along these same mule tracks. The high ridges had borne silent witness to the occupation of Greece. Villages on the plains had seen armies march through before. Empires had always crossed this crossroad between Asia and Europe, but the division of the country this time, carved into zones like meat on a table, German here, Italian there, Bulgarian farther north, had brought a new kind of humiliation. In Thessaly, where the fields rolled out like a patchwork quilt stitched from wheat and cotton, it was the Italian flag that flew over town halls. Their soldiers lounged in cafes that could barely supply bread to locals. Their trucks rattled past hungry children with crates of canned food and wine. Nikos had watched those trucks for months before he joined the Partisans. He had been a driver before the war, knew every bend between Larissa and the mountain villages, every place where fog lingered longer after sunrise, every stretch where frost turned the road into glass. When the Italians requisitioned his truck, they had taken his livelihood and left him with a ration card that seemed designed to shrink a man. Their officers had laughed when he protested. One had joked that if he knew the roads so well, he should be grateful the Italian army would now teach him how a modern nation uses them. In the cafes, officers in sharply pressed uniforms spoke of pacification, of how the villagers in these slopes were poor and stubborn, but essentially harmless. Like old donkeys that kick when you prod them but still pull the cart. The first clumsy acts of resistance had only hardened that attitude. A sentry knifed in the night in a small town, a requisitioned barn mysteriously burning to the ground, a telegraph line cut. The Italians responded with arrests, interrogations, and the occasional beating, but always with the bored air of a landlord dealing with unruly tenants. The Greeks were starving, especially in the winter of 1941-42, and people who are busy finding food are not supposed to have energy left for rebellion. That was the theory in the officers' mess, where maps spread across tables showed clean lines of supply from port to garrison, from depot to front. Reality intruded on that theory one gray February, when a patrol failed to return from a routine journey along a back road near a cluster of villages under the shadow of Mount Olympus. The bodies of Italian soldiers were found scattered along a slope, stiff fingers still curled around rifles, faces turned up toward a sky that offered neither explanation nor comfort. Their truck, riddled with bullets, lay half on its side, wheels still faintly creaking in the breeze. No one claimed responsibility. In the nearest village, men avoided the eyes of the Italian officers. Women stayed inside, doors bolted, children ordered not to stare. The investigation found nothing but silence and empty cartridges. The reply came swiftly and with a cold efficiency that shocked even those who had already tasted occupation. Trucks rolled into the village at dawn, tires crunching on frost. Men between 17 and 50 were pulled from their homes at gunpoint, lined up against a wall that had once sheltered grapevines. Smoke rose from that village all day. Nikos heard the gunfire from the next town over and smelled the smoke much later, a sweet, cloying stench carried by a wind that knew no borders. When he finally walked through the place weeks later, the walls were blackened, the square empty, only a mangled bicycle frame leaning against a charred tree. The older villagers in his valley began to mutter names that belonged to earlier wars, when burning villages had marked the frontiers of empires. He began to hear the word resistance, spoken not as abstract hope, but as a plan that had grown teeth. It was after that massacre that he met Eleni in the back room of a church halfway up the mountain, beyond the reach of casual patrols. The air in the room had smelled of candle wax and damp stone. A priest with tired eyes and calloused hands had introduced her simply. She knows things that make metal dance. She had been a school teacher once, had corrected children's handwriting, and recited poems about heroes long dead. Now she spread out sketches on a wooden table, diagrams of roads, curves, angles, slopes, and shaded areas indicating estimated kill zones. Beside them lay the small hoard that years of stealing, scavenging, and quiet British help had assembled. Bricks of plastic explosive wrapped in waxed paper, coils of detonator wire, captured Italian grenades, lengths of rusty chain. The road is their pride, Eleni had said, tapping a pencil on the map. They think vehicles and asphalt give them power, that engines will carry them anywhere they wish. But these roads cling to the mountain, they twist and hang on its side. That is their weakness. Trucks can't climb the rock, men can. We don't have tanks or planes, we have legs and lungs and cliffs, so we make the road work for us, not them. There had been skepticism at first among the gathered men, many of them peasants from the high villages, some former soldiers from 1940 who had fought the Italians in Albania. Guerrilla warfare meant ambushing a patrol on foot, shooting from behind a rock and melting away, not playing with wires and fuses like engineers. But hunger and grief are powerful solvents of tradition. They had seen what the Italians would do to villages even in response to small attacks. If they were to risk such reprisals, the blow had to be worth it. So they listened, and they learned how far sound would travel between one valley and another, how long a truck would take to climb a grade, how rock fractured when forced by explosives and gravity. Over the next weeks, trails far above the convoy routes became busy. Men who had once driven oxen or carried sacks of wheat now carried crates of explosives and spools of wire. They moved in the dark, feeling for familiar stones with their feet, learning to breathe quietly as they labored upward. Shepherd boys and old women became the eyes of the operation. A cloak of normal life lay over everything, goats grazing on scrub, markets in small towns, the endless bargaining over eggs and soap, beneath which a network hummed with purpose. A signal scratched into a barn door, a few extra loaves bought by a man known to travel, a lantern left lit in a farmhouse window on a night when the Italians thought no one had fuel to waste. On the other side of this invisible battlefield, in a requisitioned mansion in a regional town, Major Carlo De Luca shuffled reports with increasing irritation. He was not a cruel man by inclination. Cruelty required effort, and he preferred comfort. He had come to Greece believing in the picture painted by propagandists, a campaign of order-bringing, the chance to prove Italy's worth as a modern power. The Greek army had been stubborn, yes, up in those Albanian mountains. But now, it was broken. This was supposed to be administration, not war. Convoys should move on schedule. Garrisons should regard the countryside as a reserve of food and labor, not as an enemy. Yet here were reports of sabotaged telegraph lines, trucks with punctured tires, the occasional missing patrol. And in February, there had been that ambush that forced his superiors to order the harsh reprisal in the village he would rather not think about over his evening wine. He reread an intelligence summary that dismissed the partisans as peasants with hunting rifles, who had been given ideas above their station by foreign agitators. He underlined a sentence smugly stating that the local guerrillas lacked the training and equipment to mount serious operations against well-escorted convoys on main roads. When he relayed this assessment in the officers' mess, gesturing with his fork over a plate of pasta that had cost several villagers their cheese ration, there had been knowing laughter. "They'll shoot from far away at a lone sentry, maybe roll a rock down on a truck and run," one captain had said. "They don't have the stomach to stand and fight. Give me one company of carabinieri and 2 armored cars, and I'll clear every hill between here and the sea." "You worry too much, Carlo," another had added, pouring him wine. "They're farmers. They know goats and olives, not explosives. These mountains are impressive, yes, but they belong to those who have fuel and tires. Without roads, they starve, not we." De Luca had laughed with them, partly out of habit, partly to drown out the small, unwelcome thought that perhaps such confidence itself could become a weakness. Still, he authorized a schedule of convoys that assumed the roads as a given. Ammunition, food, and reinforcements rolled out on regular timetables, always along the same routes that dipped into the valleys and climbed back out between cliffs that had watched armies come and go since Alexander. On a cold night in early March, those cliffs answered the laughter. The pass the villagers called the Throat lay between 2 ridges that rose like the jaws of some ancient stone beast. The road clung to the inside of the curve, no more than a gray ribbon smeared across the mountain's flank, with a sheer drop on one side and a sloping wall of rock on the other. The day before, shepherds had grazed their animals further down, pretending not to watch as Italian trucks moved past at midday. That evening, under a sky that turned from milk blue to iron, voices carried up to the ridgeline where the partisans waited. Nikos lay once more with his cheek against the earth, but this time there would be no restraint on his trigger. Beside him, a length of wire snaked down the slope to an inconspicuous cluster of rocks just above the apex of the curve. Beneath those rocks, Eleni had nested 2 carefully placed charges over the past 2 nights, crawling like a lizard so as not to dislodge stone. A 3rd charge had been buried near a shallow ditch on the inner side of the track some distance ahead, its wires disguised among roots and scrub. The plan was simple on paper. When the first truck reached the trigger point by the ditch, they would detonate the charge to blow its wheel and tilt it across the road, blocking the path. At the same moment, the rock charges above would be fired, sending tons of stone crashing down onto the rear vehicles, closing the column in a coffin of steel and debris. Then weapons would speak, and the night would do the rest. Except paper did not account for nerves and heartbeat and the metallic taste of fear. The convoy arrived later than expected. Nikos's legs had long since gone numb. Cold had crept through his jacket and settled in his bones. He could hear men shifting quietly, whispering curses into their sleeves to keep teeth from chattering. Then, finally, the distant growl of engines rolled up the valley, a low thunder that grew into the familiar grinding cough of trucks laboring uphill. Headlights carved pale tunnels through the darkness, beams bouncing as vehicles hit potholes. The first truck's hood emerged around the bend, then the cabin. The driver hunched forward, his face pale in the reflected glow, the officer beside him in silhouette. It was the same convoy pattern as before, only this time rumored to be carrying heavier weapons for a garrison further inland. Nikos counted the trucks under his breath, feeling the rhythm of their approach. 1, 2, 3. At 7, his heart began to drum so loudly he was certain the driver would hear it. At 9, he felt Eleni's hand on the wire's insulated handle tense. The 10th truck's front wheels rolled past the shallow rut that concealed the buried explosives, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened. The world hung, poised between intention and consequence. Then the ridge shook with a flat, brutal concussion. Light and sound slammed into Nikos's skull. The front of the truck seemed to leap sideways, its axle twisted, a tire shredded into strips by the blast. Metal shrieked as the vehicle lurched across the road and slammed into the rocky inner wall. The officer and its cab vanished in a burst of glass and dust. Almost on top of that thunder came a second detonation, deeper and more resonant. Eleni had already thrown her weight down on the plunger for the rock charges. Somewhere above, the mountain groaned and let go. A rain of stones began, at first pebbles and fist-sized chunks, then larger boulders tearing free and bouncing with terrible grace as gravity claimed them. Nikos watched as the tail of the convoy disappeared under a moving curtain of rock. Headlights were extinguished in a storm of dust and debris. The last truck reared up, then toppled, its rear end lifted clean off the road. Soldiers in the back flung out like dolls. Shouts erupted in Italian, high and panicked, cutting through the echoes of the blasts. Someone fired wildly into the night, tracer rounds slicing arcs through the dust cloud. On the ridge, Nikos aimed down into that confusion, picking shapes from the chaos. Helmet glints, muzzle flashes, the pale blur of a man trying to crawl from under twisted metal, and squeezed the trigger. His old rifle kicked against his shoulder. Familiarity and recoil anchored him to the moment. Around him, other weapons spoke. Mismatched rifles from different eras. A captured machine gun rattling from a nest of rocks. A few pistols barking sharply. Below, the trapped convoy became a cauldron. The men in the middle trucks, caged between the blocked front and the collapsing rear, tried to scramble out. Some seeking cover under their vehicles, others stumbling toward the cliff edge, torn between diving into the ravine or facing the invisible enemy above. Orders were shouted, then lost in another rockfall that crushed one of the trucks entirely, splintering wood and bending steel like paper. A soldier lit a flare in panic. The sudden green light painted the rock face and the wrecked vehicles in sickly color, making targets of his own comrades. Nikos saw a man's face clearly in that light, smeared with blood and dust, mouth open in a scream that the blast had made soundless to it. For a beating moment he thought of that man as a boy in some Italian town, being told he would see the world. Change position. Came the urgent hiss of a voice close to his ear. This was not a battle they intended to fight to the last bullet. The mountain gave them the gift of surprise, but it would offer them no mercy if German bombers came tomorrow and found them exposed on ridges without cover. Nikos fired one last shot at a muzzle flash below, and then wriggled back from the edge, his body scraping over rock, the smell of cordite still sharp in his nostrils. Men rolled away, grabbed pre-hidden packs, and vanished into darkness, following goat trails no map showed, leaving behind a ravaged convoy that would burn long into the night. By dawn, smoke still climbed from the pass, dark and oily against a washed-out sky. Italian reinforcements arrived from the nearest garrison, their boots crunching on shattered glass and spent cartridges, their faces pale as they counted their dead. The road was choked with wreckage. The mountain air, usually so clean, carried the stink of burned rubber, spilled fuel, and charred meat. A captain walked slowly along the twisted line of trucks, one hand pressed to a handkerchief over his mouth. Near the front, the body of Major De Luca was pulled gently from what remained of the lead vehicle. His uniform was torn, his face blackened, his eyes closed as if in sleep. The men who lifted him onto a stretcher did so with the stunned care reserved for those who had seemed untouchable the day before. News of the ambush spread quicker than any official communique. In villages far from the pass, old men shook their heads, half horrified, half grimly satisfied. Women whispered about it when they bent over wells. Children repeated details they did not entirely understand, but felt with the peculiar intensity of the very young. For the first time, the Italian officers spoke of the partisans not as a nuisance, but as a real military problem. Reports mentioned organized use of explosives, careful selection of terrain, disciplined fire. The word peasants appeared less often. The word bandits remained, stubbornly clinging to sentences, but a new one crept in: guerrilla. Reprisals followed, as everyone in the mountains had known they would. Villages nearest to the ambush zone watched trucks roll in, and columns of soldiers spread out, rifles ready, torches and fuel cans in tow. Men were rounded up again, and walls feel the impact of bullets once more. But something had shifted. Where before, fear had been a dead weight, now it moved like a current, carrying anger with it. When soldiers dragged away a village elder, his daughter spat on the boots of the man pushing him. When a barn was set alight, the owner did not beg. He stood with arms folded, watching until the flames forced him back, his eyes never leaving the officer's face. High in the hills, the partisans watched with clenched fists. Each plume of smoke from a burning roof was a mark burned into their memory. Each cry carried on the wind a nail in a coffin they were willing to build, even if they never lived to see it completed. Eleni grew quieter after those days, her dark eyes taking on a flint edge. At night, by the murky light of an oil lamp, she and Nikos and the commander of their band, an ex-sergeant named Yanis, spread their tattered maps again and placed small stones along the roads. "They will send more," Yanis said, his finger tracing a route from the main town up to a remote garrison. "They'll increase escorts, send armored cars, maybe even small tanks. They'll call in German advisors. The road is blood now. They know it." "Good," Eleni replied softly. "Blood means they fear it, but they also depend on it more than ever. They cannot abandon these garrisons in the interior, not with the Germans watching their every move and the war turning elsewhere. They will keep using the road, and we will keep reminding them it is ours when we choose." She proposed a pattern that went beyond single spectacular ambushes. No road would feel safe. Some nights there would be nothing. Convoys would roll still under the suspicious gaze of black ridges. Every shadow suspect, but no shot fired. On other days, a mine would explode under the third vehicle, not the first. Sometimes only the last truck would be targeted, allowing the rest to flee. Sometimes they would attack with rifles alone, no explosives, to make the Italians waste time probing every culvert and drain. Variation would be their ally. Predictability would be death. They spoke of roads not as static lines, but as living creatures with joints and weak spots, places where a small wound would make the whole body limp. Spring came to the mountains as reluctantly as the occupiers' respect. Snow receded from the highest peaks, leaving behind muddy slopes and swollen streams. In the valleys, trees began to bud. In the Italian headquarters, calendars were marked not with holidays, but with losses. Convoys that had once been routine became tense affairs. Men who once lounged in the backs of trucks smoking and playing cards now sat with rifles across their knees, eyes peering outward, knuckles white on stocks. Machine gunners scanned ridges, their fingers resting lightly on triggers. Major De Luca's replacement, a stern colonel with scars from fighting in North Africa, came with German advisors in tow. Among them was Oberleutnant Franz Meyer, of a mountain division that had gained experience in Yugoslavia hunting partisans there. He had the cool eyes of someone who measured danger in terrain, not ideology. Standing at a map table, he traced the convoy's routes with a gloved finger and listened to reports of ambushes without interrupting. "You drive your trucks through a funnel and are surprised they choke," he said in careful Italian. "These passes, throat, eagle's stare, whatever the locals call them, are perfect for ambush. You cannot simply add more vehicles and expect fear to vanish. You must control the heights, dominate them, deny the enemy observation." "And how do you propose we do that?" the colonel asked, bristling. "We have limited men. We cannot garrison every hill." "You don't," Meyer replied. "You make them fear your reaction as much as they enjoy their successes. You move unpredictably. You send small patrols up the slopes to bait them into firing, then you respond with force. You burn not just villages but forests. You make the hills as hungry as the plains." His prescription was simple. Terror answered with greater terror. It was already a language the Italians understood, but now it would be spoken with German fluency. The first combined anti-partisan sweep came in May. Columns of Italian infantry, supported by German mountain troops and a few armored vehicles, moved up into the hills with packs of dogs and local guides, whose faces were as stone-like as the ridges they traversed. Planes droned overhead, their pilots looking for telltale flashes of metal or unnatural smoke. The partisans had anticipated such a move. Networks of lookouts fanned out across peaks, communicating with mirrors and coded shouts. Small bands of fighters melted away before advancing troops, leaving behind only cold ashes in fire pits and the occasional booby trap. When possible, they conducted small, sharp ambushes on the flanks of these columns, striking where they were stretched thin on narrow paths. A patrol that pressed too far into a ravine might find itself pinned under fire from above, forced to retreat with wounded on improvised stretchers. Villages paid dearly whenever the occupiers' frustration peaked. Roofs went up in flames, livestock was driven off or shot, entire communities ordered to march down to the plains for screening. Yet the more fire the occupiers poured into the mountains, the more the mountains refused to be tamed. Rock does not burn. Paths do not confess. Children evacuated to relatives in other valleys brought with them stories of soldiers who could not sleep without lights on, afraid of the silence outside. In one such child's memory, the defining sound of that year was not gunfire, but engines. "I grew up knowing the sound of trucks the way I knew the bells of the church," the boy would say many years later. Each tone meant something. A single truck, a patrol or messenger, 2 or 3, a small delivery, a long chain of them, one after the other, straining uphill. That meant something important was moving, and that maybe the road would speak soon. It spoke again in late June. This time, the target was not an Italian convoy, but a mixed column including German vehicles, moving to reinforce garrisons further west. Reports had come that the German division was planning a larger operation in the area, as part of a broader distraction effort timed with events far away, in Sicily and Italy itself. The roads that cut across the highlands had become essential. Fuel, ammunition, men, all had to cross these narrow ledges to reach remote outposts that allowed the Axis to claim control over maps shown to Berlin and Rome. The partisan command decided the moment had come to show that the new, supposedly more efficient masters of war were not immune to the mountain's judgment. Preparation for this ambush carried a different weight. German troops were known to be less tolerant of losses than Italians, more willing to retaliate with mass killings. Entire villages wiped off the map. Yet the logic of resistance had its own ruthless arithmetic. If they allowed the Germans to move unmolested, those convoys would feed operations that would strangle the life out of the very movement struggling to survive. Hitting them now, hard, might draw blood so vivid that even Berlin would feel it, forcing them to divert more men into occupation duties, away from other fronts. The chosen spot was a defile where the road squeezed between a vertical rock face and a steep drop into a dry riverbed. On one side of the river, cliffs rose like a wall. On the other, the slope climbed more gently, but was still broken by boulders and scrub. The Partisans had spent weeks studying it, crawling along ledges that goats had carved long ago, testing the angle of fire from different crevices, measuring with ropes the height from which rocks could be dropped to crush an engine block. Eleni, whose name now circulated among the occupiers' intelligence units as if she were a mythic figure more than a person, devised a sequence of blasts that would not just block the road, but trap vehicles in a staircase of wreckage. On the day of the ambush, clouds piled low over the peaks, threatening rain. The air held that charged stillness that comes before a storm. Nikos lay again with stone pressing into his chest, his cheek against the same indifferent earth, thoughts coursing back over the path that had led him here, from a truck driver hauling sacks of grain to a man waiting to fire on machines that looked much like the one he had once loved to drive. Beside him, Eleni checked the tension on the wires one last time, her fingers nimble despite the chill. "Do you ever think about what they tell their families?" he asked suddenly, voice barely above a whisper. She did not look at him. "That they are bringing civilization to savages," she murmured. "That they are fighting for their homeland. That this is all temporary, and they will come back with medals. Or that they are sent to punish bandits, so that their own children can sleep safe. It does not matter, Nikos. Their engines crush our fields. Their boots trample our thresholds. Each convoy that passes feeds the machine that starves us. I don't care what stories they tell to make that bearable." He nodded, ashamed of having asked. The truth was, he did care, because he could not scrub from his mind the face of the man in the green flare, that silent scream under stones. His own brother had died in Albania wearing a Greek uniform, believing he was defending his home from those very men. War made mirrors of enemies. Engines approached. This time there was a different timbre to their noise. German trucks were slightly heavier, their diesel note deeper. Somewhere in the column, perhaps, an armored car or a light tank added a metallic whine. The sound echoed strangely between the walls of the defile, bouncing back and forth like a warning they could not heed. At the planned signal, a shepherd's flute melody, drifting faintly from a hill far away, its tune disguised as an old folk song. Eleni tightened her grip. The first vehicle, an Italian truck pressed into German service, rolled into the kill zone. Behind it came another and another. Through his scope, Nikos saw German helmets, their shape distinct from the Italian ones, glinting slightly in the weak light. Faces looked up at the cliffs occasionally, eyes narrow. These men had learned to mistrust mountains elsewhere. They carried that wary posture with them like an extra piece of kit. It did not save them when the hillside erupted. The first blast sheared the front axle off the lead truck and hurled it sideways into the rock face. The vehicle crumpled, wooden slats splintering, its cargo of crates spilling out like disemboweled organs. Before the dust from that explosion had settled, a second charge blew under the fourth truck. The road cracked, a jagged fissure opening beneath the wheels, which dropped and twisted, the vehicle snapping like a broken limb. At the same time, a series of smaller charges along the upper slope detonated in sequence, prying loose boulders that gravity had been waiting years to reclaim. The landslide came down with a roar that drowned out everything else. It was not just sound, but a physical force that pressed on eardrums, rattled bones, made lungs spasm. Nikos felt the vibration through his ribs. Below, men threw themselves from vehicles, some successfully rolling clear, others caught like insects under the tumbling stone. A German armored car tried to reverse, its engine revving hysterically, but a rock the size of a wagon wheel slammed into its front, caving in the hood. Sparks flew as steel met stone. For a moment, there was only rock and dust, and the insane roar of machines caught in places where machines had no right to be. Then, as the avalanche ceased, came a new layer of sound, the crack and stutter of rifles and machine guns from the ridges. The Partisans had learned from previous ambushes, had divided their fire into sectors, each group responsible for a slice of the kill zone. Muzzle flashes winked along the heights like fireflies, each one another verdict delivered. German soldiers, trained to respond quickly to ambushes, tried to form defensive positions, but there was almost no cover. The wrecked trucks themselves became shields, and those who could reach them did, their rifles and submachine guns poking out from between twisted boards and shattered glass. They fired back at the cliffs, targeting the brightest flashes, the places where dust puffed from rock indicating a muzzle. Some Partisans fell that day. The mountains, for all their favor, demanded payment. Bodies slipped from ledges and tumbled down, bouncing once, twice, before coming to rest among the dead and wounded below. Oberleutnant Meyer, somewhere near the head of the column, had been walking beside a staff car when the first blast hit. He was thrown to the ground, ears ringing, mouth full of dust. When he staggered up, wiping grit from his eyes, his carefully laid theories about dominance of terrain were torn up along with the road. He saw men he had drilled in Yugoslavia scrambling like ants under collapsing debris, heard them call out for help in voices strained high with panic. He tried to impose order, bellowing commands weapons into the dust cloud, but sound died quickly in that chaos, swallowed by the mountain's echo. After what felt like hours but was likely minutes, the partisans began to disengage. They had no wish to be pinned down by German reinforcements or airstrikes. They had planned paths of retreat as carefully as they had selected their shooting positions. One by one, teams slid back from the edge, slung weapons over shoulders, and disappeared. The last shots drifted away like thunder moving into the distance. What remained in the defile was a gnarled sculpture of ruin, trucks jammed at grotesque angles, bodies strewn among broken crates, faces turned toward a sky that had seen this all before and would again. The German and Italian response was as ferocious as predicted. In the days that followed, entire stretches of the highlands burned. Villages suspected, correctly or not, of harboring partisans were emptied, their people driven down the roads under bayonets. Those same roads, so recently killing grounds for convoys, now became rivers of human misery. Smoke hung over the valleys like low clouds. In some places there was nothing left but chimneys, and the pale outlines of foundation stones where homes had stood. But the cost to the occupiers was also real. The destroyed convoy represented not just men lost, but fuel, ammunition, and time. Reports flowed upward through the chain of command, laced with words like catastrophic and unexpectedly effective. Recommendations multiplied: more troops for security, more aircraft for reconnaissance, more collaboration with local informants. Berlin and Rome, already straining under demands from multiple fronts, sent what they could, but the fact remained. Every soldier guarding a mountain road in Greece was one who could not stand on a line elsewhere. Summer tilted into autumn. In Italy itself, cracks had appeared in the regime. News filtered through clandestine radios and whispered networks. Mussolini had been deposed, the king had fled, an armistice had been signed. For days, confusion reigned in the occupiers' ranks in Greece. Italian officers met in closed rooms, voices raised, maps spread out as if cartography could give moral direction. Some units prepared to surrender to the Allies if they appeared. Others waited for German instructions with mounting dread. For the partisans, these developments brought both opportunity and peril. The Italian garrisons that had once sent convoys along the mountain roads now stood at a crossroads. Resist the Germans and risk annihilation, join the Germans and become their tools, or throw in their lot with the very bandits they had spent years fighting. In more than one town, the decision was made not in barracks, but in whispered conversations between individual officers and partisan envoys who had slipped into the shadows of courtyards. Nikos found himself one night in a cellar lit by a single candle, the air heavy with the smell of wine and damp stone. Across a rough table sat an Italian lieutenant, barely 30, his uniform rumpled, eyes haunted. "I have men," the lieutenant said in halting Greek, each word an effort. "They are tired. We came here as soldiers. Now Rome is gone." He made a helpless gesture. "The Germans, they will come. They will take our weapons and send us to camps, or worse. I do not care so much for my own life, but these boys," he broke off, swallowing. "You have fought us, yes. You have killed some of them, but you fight the Germans too. Perhaps our guns do better in your hands than in theirs." Eleni, sitting in the shadow just behind Nikos, watched the man with eyes that had seen too much to trust easily. "What do you ask in return?" she said. "Safe passage," he answered quickly, "or the chance to disappear. Some may wish to join you." He looked down at his hands, fingers fidgeting with a cap badge. "I know what we have done here. In the villages, on the roads. There will be reckoning, but war is not arithmetic. Perhaps if some of us fight on the right side now, the weight on the scales will be less. I don't know." In the end, deals like that were struck many times over, in different cellars and barns, with different names attached. Some Italians did join the resistance. Others simply handed over part of their arsenal and tried to slip away before German units arrived to disarm them. Not all were successful. Columns of disarmed Italian soldiers, guarded by Germans, trudged down those same roads later, their shoulders sagging, boots scuffing at the dust, their former arrogance burned out of them by defeat and uncertainty. The balance of power in the hills shifted abruptly. The partisans suddenly had access to heavier weapons, machine guns, mortars, even a few light artillery pieces that could be broken down and moved along mule tracks. Eleni's maps grew more complex, now incorporating positions where captured mortars could lob shells onto roads from hidden angles. The kill zones expanded. No longer were they limited to the range of worn-out rifles. For the Germans, stepping fully into the shoes of occupation in these sectors after September 1943, it was like walking into a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark. They knew there were tables and chairs, but not where their edges lay. The first months were a sequence of painful collisions. Convoys that had once moved with Italian complacency now advanced in tight formations, every second vehicle carrying men scanning the heights, fingers resting on triggers, grenades at the ready. Engineers walked ahead, probing for mines with metal detectors and bayonets. The pace slowed. Supply lines that had been tenuous became fragile. Winter came came early that year, cloaking the peaks in snow that muffled sound and made movement treacherous. For the first time, some convoys chose to wait in lower valleys rather than risk the icy, ambush-haunted passes. Yet war does not respect weather. Orders from German headquarters demanded supplies reach isolated outposts that were key to controlling river crossings and critical junctions. So trucks once more climbed, their engines straining in the cold, exhaust hanging like ghosts in the air. Nikos remembered one such column particularly well. The snow that day came in fine, dry flakes that stung the eyes and dusted everything in white, blurring edges and making the road look narrower than ever. The world seemed reduced to three colors: gray rock, white snow, and the dark shapes of trucks and men. He lay in a hollow behind a rock, his breath turning into tiny clouds that immediately vanished into the falling veil. Beside him, Eleni cupped her hands around the detonator, her fingers red with cold. "They still think their vehicles mean power," she said quietly, almost to herself. "In weather like this, their rubber and steel betray them. They cannot leave the road. The snow swallows them." "We can." She nodded toward the steep slope behind them, where a narrow path twisted upward, invisible to anyone not born with mountain dust in their blood. Below, the first truck's wheels slipped slightly on a patch of compacted snow, fishtailed, then caught again. The driver's shoulders eased a fraction in relief. That tiny relaxation, that belief that the road, treacherous but obeying the laws of physics he understood, was safe enough, was precisely what the Partisans had learned to exploit. In that moment, she pressed the handle down, and the mountain once more ate engines and men. Years later, after the Germans had withdrawn, and new wars had come to the streets of cities, some of those who had fought in the mountains struggled to explain to their children what it had meant to turn roads into weapons. They spoke not in maps or grand strategy, but in small memories. The smell of wet wool on comrades huddled in a cave, sharing a cigarette before an ambush. The feel of stone under fingertips as they inched along a ledge in darkness so complete it seemed like a substance. The sound of a truck's final choking cough as it died in a place where no truck should have been. For Nikos, the road always led back to one afternoon many years after the war. He was an older man by then, his hair gone thin and gray, his hands scarred but steady. Greece was officially free of occupiers, though never free of arguments about who had really liberated it, and at what cost. New governments had risen and fallen, new uniforms marched in parades. On that day, he found himself in a bus winding along a familiar mountain road, now widened and paved better, guardrails installed where once there had been only empty air. Tourists were on the bus with him, chattering in different languages, their cameras ready for the spectacular view promised in guidebooks. They leaned eagerly toward the windows when the bus entered the stretch above the Old Throat. Below, the valley spread out in peaceful greens and browns, smoke from village chimneys curling lazily, not in panicked columns. The driver, a young man who knew the road only as a job, whistled a tune under his breath, one hand light on the wheel. Nikos looked out and saw, superimposed on the present, the ghosts of trucks that had burned here, the flashes of rifles, the white spray of shattered rock. He saw Major DeLuca leaning back in his cab, laughing, cigarette in hand. He saw Meyer's face half hidden by dust as he screamed orders no one could hear. He saw Eleni, younger than he was now in that memory, her hands sure on the detonator, her jaw set. The bus shuddered slightly as it hit a patch of uneven pavement, and a child squealed in delighted fear. "It's like flying!" the child exclaimed. The other passengers laughed. The driver threw a joking remark over his shoulder about not looking down. No one mentioned war. He pressed his palm to the cold window, feeling the vibration of the engine, the hum of rubber on asphalt. The road no longer belonged to any army. It carried farmers to market, children to school, lovers to secret meetings. It was what a road should be, a line of connection, not division, a path of life, not death. Yet under the new asphalt lay old scars, lines of shrapnel and bones of trucks rusted to nothing, fragments of human bone that the mountain had kept and ground slowly back into itself. He thought of the arrogance that had first brought those vehicles here in long, contemptuous lines. Men who had believed that modern war was something fought with technology alone, that rifles and discipline could bend any landscape to their will. They had looked at the Greeks in the hills, thin, underfed, armed with mismatched weapons, and laughed. Peasants, bandits, a joke. Then the roads had become kill zones, the very arteries of their lifeline clogged by ambushes and fear. The mountain remembers, his grandfather had once said when telling stories of older wars. We forget, we argue, we change flags. The mountain remembers the sound of every engine, the weight of every boot. Sitting on that bus, watching the familiar curve approach, Nikos realized what he had become to this place. One of many whispers in a long story. A man who had once dug his fingers into cold rock and decided that enough was enough. As the bus rounded rounded the bend, he closed his eyes for a moment. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he heard the boom of charges, the rattle of rifles, the curses and prayers in multiple languages all tangled together. He smelled cordite and pine, fuel and sweat. Then the bus emerged onto the straight, laughter bubbled again, and the present reasserted itself with the mundane finality of people arguing over where to stop for lunch. He opened his eyes and looked once more at the road stretching ahead, clear and sunlit, and felt no regret for what they had done, only a lingering sadness for the necessity. Arrogance had been paid for in blood, both theirs and the enemy's. The roads had been weapons when they needed to be. Now, in peace, they were simply roads again. But somewhere deep beneath the asphalt, the mountain still remembered, and in the long echo of that memory, the laughter of those who had once mocked peasants who dared fight back had fallen silent forever.